Hello and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 74, Aleksandr Nevsky Part 2, Aleksandr and the Mongols. Aleksandr became Grand Knyaz of Vladimir in 1252. The Aleksandr of the life is a clear-cut picture. Close relations with the Mongols, a strong supporter of the Orthodox Church, and untiring resistance to the West and the Catholic Church in particular. He deals with any sign of rebellion in Novgorod with swift action, whether the rebellion is against him or the Mongols, and he keeps his family under firm control. Of course, we can't rely on anything the life says, as it is explicitly a work of propaganda. But when we turn to the chronicles, it's a bit more problematic. The big holes in the narrative that we've been seeing recently continue into Alexander's reign. This is not due to Mongol depredations, or even that ideology of silence that we talked about last time. It's the same old reasons again. Aleksandr will be followed on the throne of Vladimir by two of his brothers, one of whom we already know was hostile to him, Yaroslav, who had been an ally of the usurper Andrei. And then Yaroslav would be followed by his son, usually assumed to also be hostile to Aleksandr. That adds up to years of Alexander's enemies calling the shots for the chroniclers, erasing or rewriting anything that suited them. We actually get more information about Alexander from the Novgorod Chronicle than from the Vladimir records. The hostility between the brothers did not cause any more problems in Alexander's lifetime, though, once Andrei had been dealt with. Despite the usurpation, the rules of lateral succession and genealogical seniority held strong. The Rostov Всеволодичи, Konstantin's sons, Vasilko of Rostov and Всеволод of Yaroslavl, died without ruling in Vladimir, so their descendants were out of the running. Yuri's children died without any children of their own in 1238, so there were no rivals to Yaroslav. We don't know whether, or if they were, how the Rostov knyazes were subordinated to the Grand Knyaz. It's usually presumed that they were, because previously Yuri had moved them from town to town as if they were, but we have no actual records to confirm this. We do know that Alexander chose Boris of Rostov to send to Sarai to make the arrangements for permitting Andrei to return from his exile in Sweden, and Boris visited Sarai with Alexander later and took part in the census for the Mongols. This all suggests that he did indeed serve Alexander. As I previously mentioned, Alexander's uncles, Sviatoslav and Ivan, died without doing anything else that the chroniclers wanted to mention. Sviatoslav's son Dmitry received Yuriv Polsky, and Ivan's son Mikhail received Starodub. So his only real problem as far as challenges went were his two brothers, Andrei and Yaroslav. If you remember from the last episode, when Alexander and his Mongol allies defeated Andrei and Yaroslav, Andrei first fled to Novgorod. He found no shelter there, as the city, Posadnik, and archbishop were all strong supporters of Alexander. He moved on to Pskov, where he was allowed to wait for his wife to join him from Vladimir, and then to Reval, now Tallinn in Estonia, where he took ship for Sweden. Yaroslav had a tougher time of it. He and his children were captured by the Mongols, and his wife was killed. He managed to escape and return to Tver, but was soon forced to flee. He set off with some of his boyars for Ladoga, presumably planning to follow Andrei to Sweden, but had a change of heart on the way and went to Pskov. He arrived in Pskov in 1254 with a new posadnik, Ananya, in Novgorod, and a new anti-Aleksandr mood in the city. The Novgorodians threw out Alexander's son, Vasily, and brought in Yaroslav. And that's all we know. The chronicle states that Novgorod was in rebellion and that Yaroslav fled early on. He does not reappear in the narrative for another 3 years. The situation was not tenable in the long term. Alexander could not rule peacefully in Vladimir while his brothers were in arms against him, and there was no settlement. To the extent we can read between the sparse lines of the chronicles, Andrei and Yaroslav had solid support in their patrimonial domains. At least some troublesome level of support in Novgorod, Pskov, and the other cities. And this is usually interpreted as unhappiness over Alexander's pro-Mongol policies. Although, as a counterbalance to this, no one wanted to see Andrei returning with a Swedish army either. So Alexander was forced to seek peace. Alexander began by offering Andrei Suzdal, now without a knyaz since the death of Sviatoslav. Andrei agreed and returned to a warm welcome in 1255. The reconciliation appears to have been genuine. A minor problem arose because it turned out that Alexander had not cleared the allocation of Suzdal with the Mongols. It took 2 years and Boris of Rostov's trip to intercede with the new Mongol leader, Ulashi, before Andrei could take the throne of Suzdal. While he waited, Andrei governed Nizhny Novgorod. Andrei then disappears from the chronicles, other than accompanying Alexander to Sarai a couple of times and helping to enforce the census in Novgorod. The chronicle gives us no account of the reconciliation with Yaroslav. He is described as accompanying Alexander to Sarai once and joining Alexander's son Dmitry on a campaign. Other than that, he is not mentioned until he becomes Grand Knyaz in 1263. We have to assume that they'd reached an accommodation, and he caused him no more trouble. While he had trouble with his brothers, Alexander enjoyed the absolute support of Metropolitan Kirill, who, if you remember from last time, is, by most accounts, the likely author of the life. Kirill had originally been Daniel of Galicia's man. He had served as his chancellor, and Daniel had picked him as the new metropolitan and sent him to Nicaea to be consecrated. If you recall, Daniel's flirtation with the Pope had caused some problems there, and although Kirill had eventually been consecrated, he had been sent back to Vladimir rather than to Daniel. Why Nicaea, you may be answering? Well, this is because Constantinople was still occupied by the treacherous Latins who had sacked it in the Fourth Crusade. Kirill spent almost 5 years in Nicaea while the wrangling over his appointment progressed, and he came back to Vladimir as staunchly anti-Catholic as it was possible to be, and ready to make Alexander his champion against the West. When Alexander returned in 1252, Kirill gathered the city to meet him at the gates, crowned him, and continued to reside in Vladimir rather than Kiev for the rest of his life. In contrast to the Catholic West, the Mongols did not stir his enmity. He established a bishopric in Sarai in 1261, which became an important diplomatic channel between the Grand Knyaz, the Khan, and the Byzantines. The Orthodox Church had turned firmly towards the East, rather than pursuing relations with Western Christians. The Life relates an incident where envoys from the Pope come to visit Aleksandr. They bring a message that, quote, "We have heard that you are a pious and glorious prince, and that your land is great. For this reason we have sent you two of the most skillful cardinals, Gold and Guermont. Listen to their teaching concerning the law of God." End quote. But Aleksandr is unwavering in the face of this invitation to convert, responding simply, "We know all this, and we will not accept any teaching from you." The Mongols treated the church well. It was exempt from the census, and therefore from taxes. Monks, priests, and church servants were also exempt from conscription. Later, the church would be given special charters of immunity to defend its privileges. So if we go back to that problem we discussed last time, of the difficulties the churchmen writing the chronicles had with conceptualizing themselves as conquered, and we combine that with all the benefits that loyalty to the Mongols conferred on the church's biases, the reasoning behind promoting Aleksandr as the great defender of orthodoxy against Catholic aggression, while ignoring accommodation with the Mongols, may start to become more understandable. As far as that defense against the West went, if you guessed that his famous victories taking place before he became Grand Knyaz meant that nothing much happened once he was Grand Knyaz, you'd be right. The chronicles report ongoing fighting against the Lithuanians, Swedes, and Germans over Smolensk and the borders of Novgorod, but it's all minor stuff, border skirmishes mentioned in passing. The Lithuanians put on a couple of serious attacks in 1253 and 1258, but they don't result in anything noteworthy. In 1262, Mindaugas switched alignment. He broke with Rome and the Teutonic Knights and entered into a treaty with Alexander instead. Together they mounted a campaign into Estonia, but Mindaugas died before the alliance could really develop, and his son, Vaishvilkas, did not continue it. A long-term alliance between Vladimir and Lithuania could have seen this part of the world develop quite differently. The Knights don't appear to have invaded during Alexander's reign at all, but that combined campaign with the Lithuanians we just mentioned, which included troops from Tver, Novgorod and Polotsk, succeeded in capturing Yuriv, now Tartu, in Estonia, one of the Knights' key cities. The Swedes also provided no threat during Alexander's reign. In 1256, the Pope called for a crusade against the heathens of Eastern Europe, which was widely ignored. Perhaps in response, the Swedes sent a small expedition to the Narva River with some Finnish mercenaries, but as soon as they heard Alexander was gathering an army, they ran away home. In the winter, Alexander led his own expedition into southern Finland. The chronicle doesn't give any details past saying that they captured or killed many Finns and returned home safely, but there were no more Swedish attacks for the next couple of decades. So Alexander was secure on his throne. He had the full support of the church, and he continued to safely maintain his borders against Western threats. In this new era, where Kiev had been devastated and any illusion of a united Rus was lost, Alexander was one of three rulers, along with Daniel of Galicia and Mindaugas, laying the foundations for new kingdoms that claimed parts of Rus. As the strongest and most important of the northeastern knyazes, how could the Grand Knyaz of Vladimir square uniting Susdalia, Novgorod, Pskov, and Rostov with being a vassal of the Mongols? Was this a case of making a show of submission to avoid conflict, while attempting to maintain actual independence? There were several episodes during Alexander's rule that shed some light on this. As we've already heard, although Novgorod had been quiet for a decade after the battle on Lake Peipus, we know that there was still a large opposition party, and that pro-Western elements appear to have had strong influence. As long as Alexander was the knyaz and was frequently in the city, however, he was capable of keeping them suppressed. The problems began to arise once he moved to the throne of Vladimir and appointed his son Vasily as knyaz of Novgorod. Vasily was another child knyaz, not more than 12 years old at the time he was appointed. First came the incident with Yaroslav. The chronicler describes the situation as the great boyars supporting Alexander, while the lesser boyars, led by Posadnik Anania, supported Yaroslav. According to the chronicle, the commoners, wealthy people, and merchants were also on the side of Yaroslav, who fled as soon as it looked like Alexander would defend his interests. Both pro- and anti-Alexander parties held their own veche to decide their demands and drew up their own armed defenders. For his part, Alexander demanded that his enemies be handed over. The veche of the lesser boyars decided that they would make a stand and declared themselves ready to sacrifice their lives for Novgorod. The great boyars decided that they would crush the lesser boyars and bring Alexander back. Only the intervention of the archbishop managed to avoid bloodshed. Alexander withdrew his demand that his enemies be handed over, with the exception of Anania. If they did not comply, he said he would break with the city and maybe go to war. Further negotiations by the archbishop persuaded him to agree to Anania resigning as Posadnik. The grandson of a previously mentioned loyal Posadnik, Tverdislav, one Mikhail Stepanovich, was chosen as the new Posadnik, and Alexander entered the city. Although our sources are as scant as usual for this period, historians have read quite a lot into this incident. First, it's taken as evidence of continuing opposition to Alexander's Mongol appeasement policy. The seriousness of the situation comes through even the limited details of the chronicle. They were on the edge of war, and Alexander had to make serious concessions to avoid it. Of course, we have seen many times that almost any knyaz ended up having trouble keeping the support of the independent-minded Novgorodians, but the level of opposition here seems particularly strong. And if we take the chronicle at face value, it looks like the opposition was the majority. The people of Novgorod do not share the anti-Western feelings of the chroniclers and the author of the life. This should be no surprise, as Novgorod's existence had always been based on the Baltic trade. There were Hanseatic merchants living in Novgorod, and we can assume that they were running their own influence operations in the city. It's also likely that this incident was the trigger for Aleksandr reaching an agreement with his brothers and bringing Andrei back, to avoid any further possibility of Novgorod proclaiming someone else as knyaz. It was not the end of the trouble, though. In 1257, the Mongols carried out their first census of Ruslans, an essential step towards making the knyazhestva into tribute-paying vassals. The census began in the knyazhestva subordinate to the Grand Knyaz of Vladimir, including Murom and Ryazan. No opposition is recorded. The chronicle simply states that the census officials counted everyone so that they could decide taxes and military obligations. They exempted the clergy and appointed Russian officers for the tens, hundreds, thousands, and hundred thousands of the now classified population. In the summer, the people of Novgorod heard that census officials were on their way and intending to collect a tithe as well as a tamga, or customs levy on the merchants. The chronicle writes that the news plunged the city into confusion. Anania and his replacement as Posadnik, Mikhalko, were both killed during this confusion. Alexander's son, Vasily, took the side of the opposition lesser boyars, but fled to Pskov when his father arrived with the Mongol officials. Mongol demands for payment of taxes and customs levies were rejected by the city. Instead, they tried to buy the Mongols off with lavish gifts for the Khan. Alexander had not brought enough troops to force the issue, so the Mongol officials left, while Alexander took his frustrations out on his son's advisors. Men were sent to Pskov to recover Vasily, and he was brought back to Vladimir in disgrace. The leader of his druzhina was executed, and the advisors lost their noses or eyes. The chronicler notes that every bad man comes to a bad end. A new Posadnik was appointed, and Alexander returned home after warning the boyars that any rebellion would be met with execution or mutilation. Alexander probably expected that all this would get him into trouble, and before too long he, his brothers, and Boris of Rostov were summoned to Sarai. No details are given, besides them all paying honour to the Khan, but we can guess how it went easily enough from what happened next. At the end of 1259, a messenger was sent from Vladimir to tell Novgorod that they could either comply with the census or they would be invaded. The armies are already gathered, the message added ominously. Novgorod agreed to accept the census, and most of the group summoned to Sarai, Aleksandr, Andrei, and Boris, arrived with a large contingent of Mongol officials. Yaroslav was probably left behind due to his past history in the city. The knyaz's druzhiny and the Mongol troops pitched camp at Gorodische, just outside the city, and began taking the census. Despite the supposed agreement, problems began almost immediately. The same split still existed. The commoners, merchants, and lesser boyars rejected submission. The great boyars were aligned with Alexander. The chronicler relates that the accursed Tartars did much evil while collecting the tax, and some of the collectors were killed by the townspeople. The Mongols demanded that Alexander protect them, and he ordered the Posadnik's son and the boyars' servitors to guard the officials. The city was on the edge of war again, and Aleksandr had to bring the Druzhiny and Mongol troops up from Gorodisha into the city to restore calm. The chronicler describes the situation, quote, "The accursed ones rode through the streets, writing down the houses of the Christians. For our sins, God brought these wild beasts from the desert to eat the flesh of the strong and drink the blood of the boyars." End quote. 20 years after the Mongol invasion of Susdalia, Novgorod had been subjugated. What I've just described has been the prevailing interpretation of these events, but in recent decades, as historians have become more interested in actually understanding the Mongols and the period of Mongol rule, it's come in for revision. So if we run through it again, we can start with the fact that the Mongols did not attack Novgorod during their conquest of the northeastern Knyazhestva. So we might find it quite natural the people of Novgorod remained opposed to submitting to Mongol taxation. But this also raises the question of why the Mongols did not attack them then or since, which would presumably have resulted in the city's defeat. If you remember, the Mongols had reached the Novgorodian lands, but had then turned back without attacking the city. The chronicler naturally puts this down to divine intervention, which is hardly a satisfactory explanation for us. Historians have argued that the spring thaw was beginning, which made conditions unfavourable to continue, or that the Mongols were only chasing down refugees from Torzhok, which they had attacked, and had no intention of attacking Novgorod. This has some support because Novgorod was a larger city and would have required concentration of Mongol forces, maybe even siege equipment. So we can explain why Novgorod escaped attack in the initial invasion without too much difficulty. What's harder to explain is why it was left alone for another 20 years. Charles Halperin argues, quite persuasively in my opinion, that the only explanation for this that really works is that Novgorod did not, in fact, actively oppose the Mongols. If it had, the Mongols would have been forced to respond. Since they left the city alone, there must have already been an accommodation in place. We know that other cities in the northeast made agreements with the Mongols, even where we do not have any actual information on the agreement itself, and Halperin suggests that Novgorod also reached an agreement and submitted peacefully. This agreement was not recorded in the chronicle, either to avoid embarrassment for the negotiators, or perhaps because the information was removed later, but the argument goes it is simply not realistic to claim that Novgorod was left in peace to be a centre of Mongol opposition. The Lavrentyevsky Chronicle does not mention opposition to the census in the towns and cities of Susdalia. This could be because, unlike Novgorod, these places had faced the Mongol armies during the invasion. Or it could be because the chronicle was written for Aleksandr and reflected his position. So we simply read that the officials counted all the land of Suzdal, Ryazan and Murom, without any reference to wild beasts and drinking blood. However, subsequent events suggest that the ordinary people did indeed oppose the Mongols. The narrative we've gone through there, with the tax collector setting off a crisis in Novgorod and Aleksandr and the Mongols suppressing it, is based on an interpretation of the Novgorod Chronicle, which is generally declared to be more reliable than the Lavrentyevsky Chronicle because it was written at a distance from both Vladimir and the Mongols, and is therefore taken more or less at face value. But Halperin sees a number of issues with this. First, he argues that the Mongols' first demand was always submission, not taxes. Taxes were only demanded from cities that had already submitted. No demand for the submission of Novgorod was made, therefore it follows that it had already submitted. Second, unlike the Lavrentyevsky chronicles' references to the Suzdalian Kняжество, the Mongol officials who come the first time and are supposedly bribed to go away are never actually called census takers. It's usually assumed that that's what they were, but they could just as easily have been officials sent to make preparations for the census that came 2 years later. The politics in the Novgorod Chronicle are also confusing. The chronicle implies that Vasily and the boyars are opposed to Aleksandr collaborating with the Mongols, but it never actually says that this is the case. And the chronicle gets more confusing. The message that is brought from Vladimir regarding the census is referred to as a lying message, although the lie is not clarified. It's clearly taken as a threat, and the chronicle tells us that the Novgorodians conducted their own census in response. This would have been truly amazing, since none of the Rus Kняжества had ever conducted a census. None of them had the administrative apparatus or the know-how necessary to do one. Until the Mongols came and showed them how to do it, a census was something that they simply had no concept of. The situation gets no clearer when the Mongols arrive, along with Aleksandr, Andrei, and Boris. The tax collectors again run into opposition, and the Mongols call Aleksandr for protection, or else they will leave, presumably to return in force. Everything about this episode is strange. The Mongol officials are described as accompanied by their families, which would be highly unusual, especially as the official named as being in charge appears from other records to have travelled all the way from China. There is no mention of translators, which are usually referred to in the chronicle, and the Mongols' request for protection from Aleksandr is presented as if it was something that just came up because things were not going well. But why else would Aleksandr and the other knyazes have been there with the Mongols if they were not helping to enforce the tax collection? The taxes themselves are also rather ambiguous. Mongols, and steppe nomads in general, applied their taxes evenly across the population. Everyone paid 10%. Here, however, the chronicle claims that the rich of Novgorod cut a deal to pay less, while the common people paid more. This strange claim, therefore, undermines the idea that the Novgorod Chronicle is providing a more accurate description of events, since it's contrary to what happened everywhere else. So we have two quite different interpretations between the traditional narrative and a more revisionist approach from a modern historian interested in interrogating the old assumptions about Mongols in Russia. Once again, we have to go back to the question of how reliable the chronicles are and what the chroniclers are trying to do. It seems that the argument that Novgorod is further away from the Mongols and outside of the propaganda efforts of succeeding Grand Knyazes, and therefore that its chronicle is more reliable, could be an oversimplification. Yes, it's not difficult to look at the Lavrentyevsky chronicle and draw conclusions from the gaps and later additions, but this does not mean that the Novgorod chroniclers did not have their own agenda. The Novgorod Chronicle was written by monks working for the archbishop. The Archbishop of Novgorod was chosen from the abbots of the city's monasteries and was therefore a local man integrated into local politics, which, as we have seen, were characterized by factionalism, feuds, and occasional, sometimes violent, revolts. Sometimes there were disputes among the oligarchical boyars, sometimes between the elite and the commoners. The church sometimes mediated, but sometimes also took sides. The tale of the census attempts to show the church on the side of the common folk, and is critical of the boyars for going along with paying taxes to infidels. But Aleksandr is presented as more of a peacekeeper, somehow escaping any blame for his collaboration with those infidels. The chronicler mentions the church several times in connection with the census and taxation, implying that it suffered and resisted, without providing any details. But we know that the church was exempted from the census and did not pay any tax, so this is at the least misleading. In direct contrast to the traditional narrative of the census affair demonstrating Novgorod's patriotic defense of its independence and resistance to the Mongols, Alperin concludes that the only facts the chronicle gives us with certainty are that the Mongols conducted a census and Aleksandr helped them. The Novgorodian great boyars were happy to submit. The common people were unhappy paying taxes due to religious bigotry. The chronicle complains about the Mongols being infidels, not conquerors, and Novgorod's reputation for heroic resistance and democratic values are just myths. Novgorod actually reached an accommodation with the Mongols, just like all the other kняжества. Following the 1257 census, the Mongols continued collecting taxes and recruiting people to serve in their armies. The chronicle continues to gloss over the whole subject, but then in 1262 the people of Rostov, Vladimir, Suzdal, and Yaroslavl, and it was the people, not the rulers of those cities, called Veche and decided to drive out the Mongols. The recorded complaints are all tropes of great destruction, violence, and suffering and misfortune caused by the Mongols, rather than any specific particular incidents triggering the revolt. The Mongols are said to force people unable to pay the tax to work off their debt, destroy families by conscription, or taking people to sell into slavery. Some of the chronicle describes the Mongols as Muslims, which is anachronistic. There were Muslim Mongols, but the official conversion was still in the future, and it includes incidents of them trying to tax the clergy or defiling churches. This kind of mass uprising across multiple towns and cities must have had some kind of organization, as so many outbreaks appearing spontaneously would just be too much of a coincidence, but none is recorded. The Nikon Chronicle, written, as I mentioned last time, a couple of centuries later in Muscovy, tries to present the rebellion as initiated by the knyazes heroically resisting the Mongols, but the contemporary Lavrentievsky Chronicle does not mention any knyaz involvement, and the life of Aleksandr does not mention the rebellion at all. The Mongols were now ruled by Batu's brother, Berke. He was at war with Hulagu of the Ilkhanate, the Mongol rulers of Persia, and he needed conscripts for his armies. His reaction was immediate. Armies were sent north to put down the rebellion, and Aleksandr was summoned to explain his failures. The Life and the Chronicle state that he went to beg Berke to spare his people from this misfortune, that is, the Mongols' punitive action. Berke kept Alexander in his camp through the winter and into 1263. He fell ill. In this case, unlike several others that we've already seen, there are no claims that he was poisoned. Instead of returning to Vladimir, he travelled to join Andrei in Gorodets. He took monastic oaths and was tonsured, and died in the town on 14th of November 1263. Metropolitan Kirill and all the clergy of Vladimir met the caravan carrying his body in Bogolyubova and carried it back into Vladimir. He was buried in the monastery of the Nativity of the Mother of God on 23rd of November. Speaking to the gathered people, Kirill declared, quote, "My children, know you that the sun of the land of Suzdal has now set. Never more shall such a prince be found in the land of Suzdal." End quote. Many rulers in history have been assessed quite differently by later generations. Policies criticized at the time may, in hindsight, turn out to be decisive for the future course of a kingdom. Equally, the beloved heroes of contemporaries may look less impressive with time. I think many of you will agree with me when we look at Alexander's life. We can certainly call him a moderately successful knyaz who seems to have made the most of difficult circumstances. But it's hard to see what would make him the greatest Russian in history. We can deal with the claim that he was the great defender of the Rus Knyazhestvo against Western aggression fairly easily. Despite all the claims made by Russian and Soviet historians, there was no grand Western plan to conquer the East. There was no papal conspiracy. There was no large-scale Western invasion of the Knyazhestvo either before or during his reign. Even if the Germans, Lithuanians, and Scandinavians had thought that the Mongol invasion fatally weakened the Rus and gave them a window of opportunity, they did nothing to take advantage of it. The border skirmishes that Aleksandr took part in did not stand out from the normal state of affairs, either before or after him, and only showed that Novgorod remained as capable of defending its borders as it had been before the Mongols arrived. While the Orthodox Church may have been becoming increasingly hostile to Catholics, Alexander's relations with the West were pretty run-of-the-mill for a Rus knyaz. He conducted negotiations to marry Vasily to the daughter of the Catholic King of Norway. He concluded treaties with Norway, the Germans, and the Lithuanians. He corresponded with the Pope. So we can simply dismiss the idea that Alexander saved his kingdom from the West, as there was no threat for him to save it from. But did his policy of appeasement save his kingdom from destruction by the Mongols? Did his personal humiliation before the Khans save his people to build the future Russian fatherland? Was he the champion of orthodoxy who saved the church? Or was he just another knyaz prepared to do anything it took to hold on to his throne? We can dismiss the defense of orthodoxy here too. Religious tolerance was the standard Mongol policy, and they would have cultivated relations with the church and not imposed forced conversions on the people, whatever happened. It does appear to be true that, from Alexander becoming Grand Knyaz to the 1262 uprising, there was minimal Mongol interference in his realm. However, during this period, the Mongols were actively campaigning in southern Rus and Lithuania and were at war with their Ilkhanate rivals, so maybe they were just too busy to make Vladimir and Novgorod a priority. By crushing his brothers and Novgorod independence, Alexander ended opposition to the Mongols among the elite and established their submissive status for a long time to come. Even though signs of hostility to the Mongols and to him, which we have to interpret as hostility to his pro-Mongol policies, are not too hard to find in the chronicles. I find the arguments about elite collaboration with the Mongols persuasive. We don't need to dig deep to see how he personally benefited. The same goes for the other knyazes who accepted their vassaldom. I find the arguments that the common people were not hostile to the Mongols, or were only hostile out of religious bigotry, much less persuasive. In the first place, is it really religious bigotry when we're talking about someone who invaded and conquered you? Second, put yourself in the place of the average Rus commoner. You pay levies on trade, you occasionally pay tribute in kind, but you generally just go about your life. Then an invader arrives. Officials come to your village, writing out lists of all your family members and all your property. Nothing like this has ever happened before. Then they say you owe them 1/10 of everything you own, and they're taking your son as a soldier and 2 of your daughters to sell to the Italians in the Black Sea. They don't speak your language, they don't look like you, they don't follow your religion. They're ready to punish anyone who objects at the drop of a hat. Are we really supposed to believe that this did not create any hostility or resistance? So I think we have to conclude that Alexander saw his opportunity to seize power in collaboration with the Mongols, and it worked out very well for him and his successors. We can't conclude that he saved his kingdom to form the future Russia because there's no evidence the Mongols wanted to destroy it. They wanted to have vassal knyazes running it, and they wanted it to flourish and supply them with tribute and men. This period marked a transition from Rus to what would be coming after. 3 new centers of power emerging after the fall of Kiev under 3 more or less contemporary leaders, Mindaugas of Lithuania, Daniil of Galicia, and Aleksandr of Vladimir. All 3 of them find themselves in a position where they have to look for outside support. Mindaugas and Daniil turn to the West, asking the Pope to give them a crown and bring them into the Western political system. Neither of them get anything out of it. Mindaugas even ends up renouncing both his crown and Christianity. Daniil loses his attempt to control the Rus Church. Their actions mean that the Mongols have to respond. Daniil is forced to break his alliance with the Lithuanians and join his Mongol overlords in war against them, though Daniil refuses to go in person. But both Mindaugas and Daniil remain on their thrones, and the Mongols do not destroy their lands. Alexander turned east rather than west, and the Mongols backed his claim to be the new Grand Knyaz and rule over the other knyazes much more effectively than the Pope or the Holy Roman Emperor had done for Mindaugas or Daniil. Alexander himself also seems to have been an effective knyaz. In the steppe there was also a transition. Mindaugas and Alexander died in 1263, Daniil in 1264, and in 1266 Berke died. The new Khan, Mengu Timur, was the first who had not personally taken part in the Western campaigns. He had only been born around 1240. The Ulus of Georgia was breaking with the Mongol Empire and becoming the Ulug Ulus, the Great Horde, its own independent empire. So, does Alexander's reputation rest on the accident of living in significant times? On people hundreds of years in the future looking back and saying this all started under Alexander rather than his personal accomplishments? Maybe we are just looking at it wrong. The evidence suggests that his veneration as a saint began very soon after his death, probably promoted by Metropolitan Kirill. However, it was very much a local Vladimir cult. By the time the life of Alexander was written in the 1280s, Mongol authority was firmly in place throughout the northeastern Knyazhestva. Batkaks, the officials responsible for taxes, had been appointed, the census had been taken, and regular payments were being made, none of which gets mentioned in the life. The entire political side of Rus' relations with the Mongols is left out, and Alexander's relations with them are free of any context. We can compare the life's version of Alexander visiting Batu with the description of Daniel visiting in the Chronicle, especially given the claims that both tales were written by Kirill. In both, the knyaz's humiliation is presented as something religious rather than political. Neither acknowledges that they are there to recognize Mongol overlordship. Daniel is described as enslaving himself, while Alexander is described in neutral terms. But the only real difference is in the attitude to the knyaz, not their relations with the Mongols. Alexander's heroism, as depicted in the life, does not depend on and is not compatible with ideas about patriotic resistance to conquering invaders. Instead, it is designed to present what the historian Mikhail Chernявsky called Alexander the princely saint and saintly prince. In this narrative, Alexander fights one foreign enemy to defend his people from the Catholics, and sacrifices himself to defend his people against another foreign enemy, the Mongols. This sacrifice mostly comes down to humiliating himself through submission, but in doing so he's imitating Christ, who also submitted and allowed himself to be killed. Therefore, there's no contrast for the life between heroically fighting the Germans and unheroically submitting to the Mongols. The submission to the Mongols does not in any way detract from Alexander being a hero. For the life, both actions are heroic. So the rise of Alexander the hero rested first on how his submission and supposed suffering and humiliation made him a saint. By the time Alexander's cult began to spread more widely in the second half of the 15th century, the idea of Alexander saving his kingdom was one that easily fit into the narrative of the rise of Muscovy. As we move forwards, the reasons for his increasing prominence are also not hard to find, and the emphasis now shifts to his military exploits. Catherine II, who established the Order of Alexander Nevsky, was a German who staged a coup and made herself empress. Promoting a Russian hero who fought the Germans was good optics for her. For Stalin, promoting a Russian hero legendary for fighting the Germans was also obvious. And in our day, that popular vote he won to be named Russia's greatest historical hero was not even a fair vote. The TV station running the vote panicked when Stalin took the lead in early rounds and put a heavy thumb on the scales to get Alexander into the lead. So it seems that in the end we have to conclude that Aleksandr Nevsky, the hero, is a fictional character who developed well after his death. As Halperin summarizes, quote, Aleksandr Nevsky will remain a controversial figure in Russian history, for there is no question that he profited from the Mongol conquest and built his career on Mongol support. Perhaps it was statesmanship rather than opportunism which enabled him to realize that military political opposition to the Mongols could only lead to defeat and death, or perhaps he had no genuine conception of what he was doing. We can only infer his motives from his actions, of which we know little, or from the point of view of the life, which we know to be tendentious. End quote. Join me next episode as we move into the Mongol era proper. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.